Okay, so we're now live. Thanks for attending the second plenary session on Unsettling Science. I am Marisa Elena Duarte. I'm an associate professor at the School of Social Transformation at Arizona State University, an information scientist, and a member of the Pascua Yaqui tribe. It is the season when, for my people, our ancestors who have passed on visit us with insistence. We listen to their lessons from the past. Our sensitivity to this force strengthens our families, despite the US and Mexico's technocratic hostility against our people. Indeed, last week, Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO affectionately, formally apologized to the Yaqui Nation for 400 years of atrocities, including the recent wholesale theft of water from our territory. Within days of this apology, the bodies of 5 Yaqui individuals associated with tribal rights and environmental advocacy were found nearby in the Sonoran Desert. The media associates the homicides with cartel violence, a spectacular story that ignores the underlying state violence, water theft, industrial contamination, heightened arsenic in children's blood likened to a genetic curiosity, illicit construction of an explosive natural gas pipeline, reneged offers of funds for scholarships in clinics, employment of private security thugs, and a lukewarm investigation into the now routine kidnappings of Yaqui people, especially environmentalists. AMLO promises to correct the injustice of water theft in a season of drought and amid climatologists' predictions of irrevocable land loss due to rising sea levels spurred by global warming. Here I begin my land acknowledgement. I speak to forest attendees from Phoenix, Arizona, La Finiquera to Chicanos, Finica to Yaquis, and Otham Jevet, the northern ancestral homelands of Akimer Otham and Peeposh peoples. Here we also honor the Yavapai Nation, the Yaqui Nation, our mixed-race urban indigenous communities, and Apache peoples who were forcibly dispossessed and imprisoned nearby during their struggles for territory against the US and Mexico. This is a virtual conference and dependent on a network of climate-controlled data centers, 4G towers, and undersea cables. This network is sustained by a global monopoly of telecoms collaborating with private industry partners and with little to no nation-to-nation transaction with indigenous sovereigns. Indeed, as Arizona deploys 5G, companies mine lithium from Havasupai lands north of here. I thus invite each of us to acknowledge the technocratic entanglements of our apparatus, and from that standpoint to join me as we learn from our panelists, each of whom reveal the most unjust aspects of science and technocracy. Today, we will learn from Dr. Jessica Kolopenuk, Dr. Kelly Frisch, Dr. Rick Smith, and Dr. Nicole Charles. I'm happy to introduce this panel in the field of critical STS because their work to me is life-giving. Reading Dr. Kolopenuk's work on the ethics of bad biocitizenship, Dr. Frisch's work on crip justice as design impetus, Dr. Smith's work on colonial masculinity shaping contemporary genetic inquiry, and Dr. Charles' work on vaccine suspicion as anti-colonial critique frees me to think beyond an oppressive fear of kidnappings toward a pluriverse of knowing, of radical futurities co-created by queer, Black, Indigenous, feminist, and disabled scientists, a world of many decolonial worlds. If I may, we are not anti-science, but rather proponents of explanations the unreflexive scientific community avoids. Today, our speakers are the ones who do their jobs well, disquieting innocent science, questioning challenges such industrial era innovations as the nuclear family, assimilation, reconciliation, and the melting pot, showing how these social constructs are the offspring of prior insults to logic, such as the non-reflexive taxonomy, the classification of the natural world, the righteous desire to dominate so-called nature, and the state-sanctioned right to kill or poison one's dark-skinned, sexy, or differently abled neighbor in the name of all that is holy. But nowadays, enlightened scientists do not kill. We don't do that. Human subjects review boards prevent such horror. Instead, we create amoral robots to do that for us, or we do it overseas, or partner with industry labs, or boost just the useful parts of the machine, pipelines, crude hospitals, border walls, highways, surveillance platforms, laws and toxins, genetic mining, and of course, Dr. Frankenstein's great-great-grandchild, the internet. Now, to be clear, Unsettling Science is not about diversity or inclusion. We are researchers and scientists, not HR specialists. Our research does not promise a singular future in which all colonial subjects will enjoy the fruits of a mythical national equity. Rather, in this land acknowledgement, I would like for us to know how the soil and aquifers are our future, to know that what we put into the land and water beneath our feet shapes the enslavement, ignorance, liberation, and libidinal joy of those young ones who are just learning to eat on their own, toddle, read, and observe. Here are their professors, unsettling the myths of science and nation. Thus, it is important not to find some conceptual shortcut like, oh, these are all subaltern identities, without questioning the what that subjugates us, and the future is shaped by that subjugation. It is important not to marginalize us further by assuming, oh, these are all leftists in solidarity, without questioning the complex social histories and visions that makes each of us, from our own vantage points, incongruent with the liberal demands of the Western left. And of course, it is important not to think like a technocrat, mining the words today in search of a quote or a technical and policy fix, as if humans were permutations in the fields of an intelligent database, for that habit transforms us into monsters. With that, let's welcome Cree and Peguis First Nation scholar Dr. Kalapenuk, joining us from Edmonton, Alberta, Treaty 6 territory, and meeting place for Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Diné, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, and Inuit peoples. Dr. Frisch, joining us from Algonquin territory in Ottawa. Dr. Smith, joining us from Virginia, recent homelands to many mixed race, Black and urban Indigenous communities, and ancestral homelands of Rappahannock, Pamunkey, Upper Mattaponi, Chickahominy, Eastern Chickahominy, Nansemond, Monacan, Mattaponi, Potawatomi, Piscataway, and Nottaway peoples, and Dr. Charles, joining us from Toronto, homelands of Huron-Wendat, Seneca, and Mississaugas of the Credit, not to mention also one of the most vibrant urban, Indigenous, diasporic, and mixed-race communities in North America. Lios and Shimaniagu, may Creator have pity on us all as we go about our learning today. Okay, Jessica, are you ready?
I am. Thank you, Marissa. That was incredibly impressive with your use of the language. Okay. Hi, Tawau, which means welcome in the Cree language. Welcome to my home. My name, as you know, is Jessica Kalapenuk. I'm an assistant professor in the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta. I'm a co-founder of the summer internship for Indigenous Peoples and Genomics Canada edition, as well as the co-lead with my amazing colleague, Dr. Kim Tallbear, of the Indigenous Science, Technology, and Society Research and Training Program, what we call Indigenous STS. I'm a Cree woman from Peguis First Nation. I use she, they pronouns. I have pale skin, green eyes, and dirty blonde hair. I'm wearing today a black top like many days and black rimmed glasses. I'm streaming with bookshelves and plants as background behind me. And as Marissa acknowledged, I'm joining you today from Amiskwachee, Waskahigon, which is in Treaty 6 and Métis territory, otherwise known as Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. So today I will, sorry, I'm hearing a bit of an echo. Everything okay? Yeah, okay, thanks. Today I will be briefly extending what I've previously written in Provoking Bad Biocitizenship. And in particular, I'm going to be extending my reflection on the limitations of white normativity to address the coloniality of research training and institution building. These are the three interdependent elements of our approach to doing Indigenous STS at U Alberta. My starting point then is that in pursuing the project of Indigenous STS, we must interrogate the language that we use to articulate all that is good, our vision of the future, the aspirations of our work, and the relations that sustain it, and that we must not settle for colonial standards of ethics, democracy, and justice that have quite literally been born out of our constructed badness. And I'm indebted today to the work of Robert Williams Jr., who has informed my thinking on this. You see, for Indigenous bodies, these glorious Philistine deviations of ours, unsettling science and the study of it does not take a whole lot of effort on our part. Doing Indigenous STS means doing things in a bad way. Its very presence here, our presence here, is, to borrow from Aileen Morton Robinson, ontologically disturbing, or what Brendan Hakafitu might call monstrous. The presencing of our bodies among, to borrow from Audra Simpson, the nested sovereignty of critical Indigenous studies breaks open the deep anxieties that lay at the colonial scientific core. We are a reminder of the fundamental fragility and violence of white possession and the exceptionalism of academic freedom. We are a reminder of the unfinished aspirations of settlement. And yet here we are. Indigenous STS, as I see it, is simply a placeholder as we repurpose the constitutive logics and walls of knowledge production centers. It's not meant to grow into a discipline of sorts. Rather, Indigenous STS works to secure non-disciplined answers to questions by building and working through relations. Therefore, the work of Indigenous STS seeks to break down the bounded knowledges of disciplinary reason and map the networked interrelations of problems inhibiting and solutions strengthening the power of Indigenous bodies and peoplehoods. Because of its unapologetic disavowal of conceptual and embodied purities, and thus our methodological iconoclasm, Indigenous STS offers the transformative critique capable of propelling knowledge creation away from the imposing goodness of normativity. As such, Indigenous STS is not about bridging Indigenous and Western sciences or ways of knowing, but about lifting the fixed lines around what is thought of as being, what is assumed to be Indigenous on one hand and Western on the other, the silos that limit our possibilities of action. But Indigenous STS, as we know, is so much more than an intellectual field, and it has to be. It breaks down the real and perceived barriers between academia and the rest of society. We are, in a way, working ourselves beyond a vocation toward more expansive relations. Our work at Indigenous STS at U Alberta, as I mentioned, can be described in three interdependent areas: research, training, and institution building. Today, I'm focusing on research, and I'm going to indulge my research fetish, which is doing theory. And in particular, I'm rolling around with the following questions. What does it mean for Indigenous STS not to settle for white conceptions of ethics, democracy, and justice? How might we intentionally embrace our badness insofar as Indigenous peoples have been constructed historically as being in and of contrast to these conceptions, ethics, democracy, and justice? How do we do science indigenously? I present today in a spirit of political theorizing, of Western political theorizing, given that classical ethics, as they shape Western canons themselves, including contemporary models of bioethics, which is one subject of my own research, emerged from normative theorizing about the political unit. So we can think here, and we will, about Plato and Aristotle's polis, or the ideal city-state. So notions of goodness in the Western canon, morality, have always been linked to the political functioning of states. Plato, the Western OG, who took us on a journey to justice, the transcendental principle that orders the ideal normative polis, state. For him, justice is and was for the sake of justice, intrinsically good, a meta-value itself. And thus the polis, the city-state, as the arbiter of justice, is endowed with a positive moral purpose. The journey is a metaphorical transit of the mind through which reason is the road leading to universal singular truth. Plato binds the world, and in particular Greek planetary consciousness, up in and as a schema of oppositional antagonisms, a very familiar to us now binary epistemology that relies on valuated hierarchy, like friend versus enemy, to create a formulaic pathway to knowing. Universal truth must be deciphered from inferior forms of opinion and those contingent things perceived by the senses. Through his form, the world becomes knowable and known by the mind through reason, as it, not the senses, is endowed with the capacity to decipher what the many things have in common, that is, their form. Plato's form bleeds into Aristotle, whose teleological account of human nature shapes the moral purpose of the state. For Aristotle, humans have reason, defined as that reasonable part of the soul, which separates them from other animals. As such, humans are political animals, and so the polis, the state, is not simply directed at achieving instrumental goods, like perhaps the sophists would have had it, but is needed to secure the development of human reason and thus allow humans to meet their natural purpose. The polis, the state, should help reasonable citizens achieve eudaimonia, the good life, the virtuous life. These are very old ideas that continue to be reignited in new ways. And what I love about the Western canon is its arrogance of form. These guys gave us their playbook. And what a game with high stakes it is. These systems of thought and the sum of their onto-epistemological legacies trouble me deeply for their marriage of knowledge and goodness. And as natural as this construct has seemingly become, it was not inevitable. And further, its discursive legacy has since come at our expense. Prior to Plato's elaboration of reason and justice and Aristotle's insistence on the universalism of human nature, the Homeric epics established the iconic imagery of monstrous savagery on the frontiers of civilization. The uncivilized, lawless, and violent beings were battled by the immortal warrior hero on the edges of the world. In the transition from ancient to classical Greek thought, the transition from oral to the written word, then, the savage was transformed in this transition into a philosophical construct. In Aristotle in particular, this foreigner was brought into the language of the state. The savage became embodied in the barbarian foreigner, destined to serve the master. Plato and Aristotle thus create an enduring and unresolved dual quality of the savage as, on one hand, culturally backward, linguistically troubled, technologically inferior, and without a civilizing politics, but also, on the other hand, as the noble, or at least useful savage, who is brought into the state, subsumed into its body, a symbol that, as we know, Hobbes would go on to articulate as the Leviathan, in order to contain its difference and contribute to the functional operation of the state. Through the combination of universal form, friend versus enemy, reason versus savagery, the refinement of the language of human nature, and the empirical embodiment of the foreign barbarian, Plato and Aristotle translated myth and legend of savagery into philosophical construct, and thus positioned difference as a distinctively political problem that requires reasoned study and reconciliation. In this scheme, the language of morality is mirrored by the language of savagery. And as a result, and this is important, without savagery, there is no civilization, there is no good life, and there is no justice. Now, bear with me. The social contract theorists, of course, deviated from classical Greek thought. Opposed to advocating for the intrinsic moral good of the polis, for them, the purpose of the state was to secure instrumental goods, like for Hobbes, the preservation of life, the securing of life, health, liberty, and possession for Locke, and the promotion of a balanced intersection of liberty and equality for Rousseau. Their science of society had constitutive impacts for Indigenous peoples and the ways in which they would be categorically constructed in what was perceived, as we know, as the New World. It's during the Enlightenment period in which the language of savagery and human nature received a finely calibrated language of measurement and differentiation. It's the period in which the American Indian became the empirical embodiment of savagery, both as violent and lawless, as well as noble, the unresolved dual quality discursively inherited from classical Greek thought. The ways in which the social contract theorists constructed the origin and limit of state power through the mechanism of the social contract contributed to conditioning the possibility for making just, for justifying the dispossession of Indigenous peoples from their lands and authority, since they, the Indians, were clearly not rational enough to contract into civil society. Any attempt later on to include Indigenous peoples into this social contract would depend on our original dispossession, and therefore does not and cannot normatively nor empirically transform the colonial relation. Justice and dispossession are interdependent. When looking at the history of Western ideas, we can see very clearly that notions of goodness, of values, of morality and ethics have always been intimately tied up with the political functioning of Western societies. That accounts of human nature shape the moral purpose of the political unit, that value systems of good and bad shape and are shaped by political investments in territory and governance. And so just as Indigenous peoples have never had the luxury of naively thinking about science and politics separately, neither do many of us think about ethics and colonialism separately. Bioethics, for instance, as a field and set of institutional frameworks, have accompanied biomedical and biotechnological advances. And so they also require examination as technologies of colonial power. For when the political relations of research are framed as a question of ethical procedure rather than as a problem of colonialism, consent is imbued with the ability to settle the colonial relations that have shaped the questions being pursued. Consent, whether given implicitly or explicitly, remains structured by colonial imprisonment. In this way, the colonial power relation is not negated through bioethical protocols like the obtaining of consent, but rather operates in ways that condition the possibility, no, the necessity of consent. Furthermore, because Indigenous peoples have endured objectifying and violent experiences in research, colonial power relations have coercively directed Indigenous peoples into the contract culture, into a contracting subjectivity as a way to reduce the risk of colonial self-interest. As a result, and through ethical research, Indigenous peoples are being disciplined into a subjectivity that is structured by and acts to further structure the broader project of political reconciliation. The role that bodies, both individual and institutional, play in producing practices of reconciliation are obscured through consent. But remember that our inclusion has been conditioned by the original sin of dispossession. So where does that leave us? It would seem that we are back at the Piraeus, at the house of Cephalus with Plato. But unlike Plato and the others, I don't presume to have the answers, only more questions. As we imagine models of Indigenous power, resistance, and resurgence, how can we avoid inaugurating a utopian Indigenous political thought premised on normative ideals of ethics and justice? How do we avoid taking the politics out of our own creative determinations and of potential pathways to vibrant Native futures and power? How might Indigenous STS help facilitate a different journey? Ninanashkamun, thank you. And I am delighted to now pass it on to Kelly.
Thank you, Jessica, for that powerful provocation. And thank you, Marissa, also for your introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly Fritsch. I'm a white disabled settler beaming in from unceded Algonquin territory in what is also currently known as Ottawa, Canada. I have shoulder-length brown hair and round glasses, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Carleton University and director of the recently formed Disability Justice and Crip Culture Collaboratory. Today, I will talk about the maintenance work of being disabled in an ableist world of bad relations, particularly as ableism is deeply entangled with white supremacy, settler colonialism, imperialism, and racism, and is given shape through varied practices of eugenics, pathologization, criminalization, institutionalization and incarceration, rehabilitation, slow violence, maiming and debilitation, discourses of risky subjects, and so on. These kinds of bad social relations and forms of governance tend to frame disability as an individualized and medicalized problem. And being understood as an individualized medicalized problem comes with all kinds of maintenance work that frequently gets subsumed under the banner of disability, but is often veiled ableism and bad ableist social relations. Slide, please. A very everyday example of ableism being obscured is represented by the comic on the screen, which shows a stick character pulling a flatbed truck with boxes piled high and labeled disability forms. Below the truck, it reads, "Welcome to disability. Please fill out these forms." And this is a recognizable experience for many. Fill out forms to be considered for accommodations, forms to get healthcare or assistive devices, forms to access other forms to start a process to fill out more forms. Engaging with all these forms with their way of categorizing and delimiting of vitality and agency, not to mention the resources these forms frequently seek to protect, requires substantial maintenance work. Slide. And in part, much of this veiling of ableism under the guise of the categorized pathology of deserving and undeserving serves to reproduce a false sense of scarcity of resources in an abundant world. Disabled people frequently have the experience that our access needs cannot possibly be met or guaranteed, that access isn't possible because there are not enough resources. Scarcity frames disabled individuals as a problem, obscuring ableist social and structural relations of how abundant resources are prioritized and allocated. And the image on the slide represents some of the banal ways that this can appear in everyday life, from a sign on the bathroom that announces that this bathroom can be used by all different people, but then has a smaller sign taped next to it that reads, "Restrooms are for the customer use only," to a scarcity elevator that announces, "Celebrate your ability to use the stairs, and please give priority to those who need to use the lifts." Over and over again, disabled people are hailed to accept scarcity as good enough and as an act of benevolence because disability is the problem rather than ableism and the unimaginative notion that we can't possibly meet everybody's needs because there is not enough time, money, technology, and so on. Slide. Which is perhaps how we end up at the place represented by the image on the slide, which features 3 blue and white electric door opening buttons with the international symbol of access on them. The first button on the left reads, "Sue to operate door." The middle image says, "Wait to operate door." And the final image on the right says, "Hope for substantial progress." And I would hazard to say that in most academic conference and institutional spaces, there's a lot of waiting and hoping going on. And in the meantime, we fill out a lot of forms. Slide. There's so much research and literature documenting the ways disabled people are punished, restrained, disappeared, and otherwise harmed, documenting ableist exclusion and oppression. There is a profound archive of violence and grief that many of you already live and know deep in your bones. But one of the things I want to get at today is that our maintenance practices, and there are many practices that I unfortunately don't have time to delve into, but these maintenance practices function to create a we, function to support crip disability culture, and express some of the ways we not only figure out how to hack, tinker, get by, and survive despite ableist social relations, but also how we build the infrastructure we need to show up for each other, to build capacity for collectively dismantling, disrupting, and unsettling ableist social relations, to subvert the obscuring of ableism, to contest the individualization of disability. And so the image on the slide shows a poster of a series of political events called Cops Out of Care Work, organized by the Disability Justice Network of Ontario and the Criminalization and Punishment Education Project, as well as a photograph of a blurred group of people standing on the road in downtown Ottawa with a banner that reads, "In memory of all the disabled lives taken by state violence." Slide. This subversion of ableism in STS design, architecture, and other areas is in part what Amy Hamre and I were getting at with the Crip Technoscience Manifesto that we published in 2019 as part of a special issue of Catalyst, guest edited with Mara Mills and David Serlin. And the image of the cover of that issue appears on the slide. I won't dwell on this because Amy spoke to aspects of this at the plenary panel on Thursday, but worth emphasizing is the notion of crip or cripping as that of desiring the disruption of disability, particularly the disruption of ableist relations as they are entangled with other forms of oppression. Cripping challenges normative imperatives of productivity and functioning, instead inviting strategies based on friction and unsettling. So to crip is to embrace how the difference of disability disrupts normative practices, policies, and structures in ways that demand social transformation. In this way, to crip is not just to include disability to make our communities more accessible to disabled people, but also to contest how ableism has been constitutive to the formation of the bad relations embedded in our shared institutions, policies, technologies, and the way things are designed, and to prioritize disability justice as we work to build anti-ableist communities. Part of crip culture, then, crip technoscience names practices of anti-assimilationist disability making and knowing that is not just about knowing and making practices that are disability-led or disability-inclusive, but are also about political struggle and transformation. Next slide. What I'm suggesting is that crip technoscience is one part of many practices of crip maintenance that aids in the building of crip culture and community against ableism and entangled bad relations. And some of these maintenance projects look like the one on the slide, showing a tweet from blind advocate Chancey Fleet, who says of the New York Transit Authority, quote, "My husband responded to my confusion and woe trying to understand Union Square Station by doing in 2 hours what the Metropolitan Transit Authority will not, and creating a tactile map of the place. This is a prototype, but it only took a few minutes touching and talking it through to build a mental model," end quote. And beside the tweet is an image of the plastic tactile model of this New York Transit hub, Union Square Station. Next slide. And other forms of maintenance might look more like this representation, a 2018 anti-colonial artwork by Roger Peet entitled Above Ground in Gaza, based on the experiences of Saber al-Ashkar, a wheelchair user who lost his legs to an Israeli drone, said to be by artist Peet, quote, "fighting with sling and stone against the impossibility of history." And between these two very quick examples are many other forms of politicized maintenance. Slide. What I want to close with is a little bit unconventional, an offering of crip culture that highlights disability justice struggles via interdependence, collective access, friction and disruption, and non-human disability relations. So I'm going to do a reading from my collaboratively produced kids book, which came out earlier this spring as an offering of one way of working toward better relations. On the screen is the cover of the book, which depicts 5 pairs of legs against a bright orange background. 3 characters are standing, 1 is using a cane, and another is seated in a blue wheelchair. They are joined by a service dog wearing a harness. Below the characters is the book's title, We Move Together, and the authors' names, Kelly Fritsch, Anne McGuire, and Eduardo Trejos. Slide. And because of a scarcity of time, I'm going to be offering very abbreviated visual descriptions of the illustrations, but on our book website, wemovetogether.ca, we have several open access accessibility tools for reading the book, including detailed image descriptions, an ASL interpretation, an audio description, and various other downloadable resources. Slide. So the book opens with a group of kids and their calico cat as they make their way down a smooth path. Most of the kids are moving fast, biking, scooting, jogging, kicking a ball, and zooming along in a power wheelchair. One of the friends is stopped and waving to the kids ahead. The text reads, "We move fast." Slide. We move slow. The friends have slowed down. A few of the kids are resting on a grassy hill. Two friends are looking closely at a branch they've found. The other kids, with their cat, discover a poster for a carnival. Slide. Inspired by the poster, the kids are now playing an imaginative game as they move along a city sidewalk. The brick wall behind them turns into a blue and purple sky lit up with yellow stars. The cement transforms into a red carpet. The cat becomes a ferocious tiger. One child grows wings. The power wheelchair user becomes a golden chariot. One child holds up a yellow banner which reads, "We move together." Slide. Many different people are waiting on a city bus that is pulled over to pick up some passengers. Some of the people on the bus look impatient, like a man holding a crying baby. One kid is holding a jar with a caterpillar and looks excitedly out the bus window. Outside on the sidewalk, 3 people wait to board the bus. As the bus ramp slowly comes down, the girl who uses the blue wheelchair and her grandmother wave to the kid with the caterpillar on the bus. The text reads, "Sometimes we have to wait. Waiting can feel boring, frustrating, hard. Waiting can also feel exciting." Slide. Like butterflies, like love, we wait so we can spend time together. The 3 people have now boarded the bus, and as the girl waves her arms excitedly at the sight of her friend's caterpillar, 3 yellow butterflies float magically overhead. The kids' excitement changes the mood on the bus. Slide. The cat sits on the front stoop of an ice cream shop, licking its paw as 2 people enjoy ice cream cones on a bench. The single step at the shop entrance is a barrier for a woman using a scooter who wants to go inside for ice cream, and 2 kids and a man also look upset about this barrier. The text reads, "Sometimes when we're together, we get stopped in our tracks, like when all the fun and flavors of ice cream are just one step out of reach." Slide. We notice when things are unfair, and it helps us get creative. We make plans. We solve problems. The family from the ice cream shop is busy at work in a large yellow room with lots of other community members. They are designing and building ramps that will replace the stair at the ice cream shop. Some people are cutting wood, using saws, glue, and drills. Others are painting ramps bright colors. Slide. We build something better. The ice cream shop now has a new community-built ramp, and new ramps can be seen outside many of the shops along the crowded street, which is filled with activity, including our friend the cat, who sneaks out of the fish store with a tasty treat. Slide. We work together, kids and dogs, bodies and machines, bees and flowers, fish in water. Relying on each other helps us get where we need to go. 4 circles appear on a blue background, each containing a small scene. In a yellow circle, someone removes their guide dog's harness while the dog chews happily on a green shoe. In a green circle, an older woman and a younger man smile as they ride a purple tandem bicycle together. In an orange circle, bees move towards a pink flower. The final circle shows golden koi fish swimming in a pond. Slide. In an art gallery, a group of people sit in a circle communicating using sign language. On the other side of the room, a family is looking at the art which depicts sign language movements. One kid from the family looks with curiosity at the group signing. The text reads, "Sometimes we find ourselves in unfamiliar places. We wonder, we get curious." Slide. Inside a library, a group of friends are learning about and practicing American Sign Language. 2 of the friends are communicating using a tablet. Another friend is in the computer area watching an ASL video on the internet. The text reads, "We might have more questions than answers. Our questions can help us learn to do things differently." Slide. And discover new ways of understanding each other. Many people are moving around inside a busy grocery store. 2 of the kids from the library are trying to reach a box of cereal on a high shelf. One of the kids notices the interpreter from the art gallery walk by and signs "help" in ASL. Slide. People are gathered in a tree-lined park with a pond and a beach. Some are eating, drinking, and swimming. The text reads, "For the things that connect us are also what nourish us, like roots and tubes and straws and friends." Slide. And these things that connect us are often what challenge us. Sometimes we disagree about how to be together. Solving one problem can create another, and we don't always know how to make things better. A group of children are on the ground making posters about climate change on big pieces of paper. Some of the signs say, "Disability justice is climate justice," and "Like the oceans, we rise." Other signs say, "Keep the sea plastic free," and "Say no to straws." 3 of the kids look upset. One has a sign that says, "Skip the straw, save the planet," and the other 2 are pointing to a sign that says, "Straws are access." Slide. Someone's arms, adorned with rainbow bangles, reach towards the top of trees. Their fingers dance in the air as the sun streams through the branches and lights up the blue sky. The text reads, "Sometimes we need to take a break." Slide. Even when we're by ourselves, we never move alone, like feeling so close with someone who's far, like learning from others who have come before. Their memories can ground us, soothe us, move us. It's nighttime, and a child sits in the dark looking at photos and a poem called "You Get Proud" by Practicing. Surrounding the child is a sparkly indigo night sky filled with images of 8 disabled ancestors. Many of the ancestors have crutches similar to the child. One spirit kneels with their hand resting gently on the child's shoulder. Slide. Whether we're by ourselves or surrounded by many, our small movements can turn into big movements. We celebrate, we make change. There's a big gathering of people in the city, and some are dancing, blowing bubbles, and playing drums. 2 children hold a banner that reads, "We're in this together." Another child sits on the shoulders of an adult wearing a red shirt that says "Deaf Gain" and holds up a cell phone so that the person on the phone can participate remotely. Another child holds a sign that says "Nothing about us without us" near a kid with a sign that says "Access is love." A person wears a t-shirt that says "Water is life" while they raise a fist in the air, and another child has a blue sweater that says "Black Lives Matter." Slide. In a big park, it is fall, and it looks much like it does here in Ottawa today. There are people harvesting vegetables from community garden boxes, and the cat is happily rolling in the leaves. There are people scootering, biking, walking, jogging, and playing on a play structure. Some people are having a barbecue, someone is flying a kite, and a couple is cuddling on a bench drinking coffee. The text reads, "We move together." Thank you, and I will turn it over to Rick.
Thank you so much for that. So I want to just open my talk, Unsettling the Genome Lab. Make sure I'm unmuted here. Yes. By thanking Kim Tallbear, Marisa Duarte, and all of my co-panelists across both of these plenary sessions. I am a non-binary queer person, typically perceived as both white and male by others. I'm wearing glasses and seated in my home. I normally have a backdrop of cacti and succulent plants, but I couldn't figure that out today, so I'm in my bedroom. Welcome. And I'm in my mutant cowboy drag fullness today in this fat, slightly balding and bearded body. I'm an assistant professor at George Mason University in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, and I'm also affiliated with the Indigenous STS lab, co-founded by Kim Tallbear and Jessica Kolopenik at the University of Alberta. So my talk today is entitled Unsettling the Genome Lab. My cover slide is an image of a turquoise painted concrete foundation that's cracking open and unsettling the house above. In my short time here today, I hope to discuss some of the genealogies and sets of relations that have shaped my current understanding and engagement with Indigenous STS, and think in connection with others across these 2 plenary sessions that we've had on this topic. My focus here will be on the ways that we are bringing Indigenous STS, and for me, feminist and queer STS as well, to bear upon the Genome Lab and the way that it produces knowledge. as a way to chart how settler science makes indigeneity molecular or attempts to do so. But in the spirit of Indigenous STS, go beyond something more than critique to bring our own theories of power to the bench and take on the Genome Lab as a space of critical reconfiguration. So as a non-Indigenous scholar, my goal here is not to define what Indigenous STS is, and I want to heed Jessica Kulopenick's earlier comment that we should resist trying to concretize Indigenous STS as a field. So what I'll do here is not to define it as a field, but to think about it in ways that are, and neither will I try to think about it in ways that are disconnected from Indigenous people. Instead, my practice is going to be a work alongside my Indigenous friends, colleagues, mentors, and co-conspirators, and highlight some of the ways that we are undertaking this work together. That said, I want to briefly begin my talk with a short genealogy of a closely linked set of ideas and lived relations in Indigenous feminisms, Indigenous sovereign neurotics, and Indigenous STS. Next slide, please. In her 2002 article, Dildos, Hummingbirds, and Driving Her Crazy, Deborah Miranda partly touches on what is so deeply unsettling for science about Indigenous women's erotic power. She writes, for Indian women, this is a quote, for Indian women to express the erotic is almost as frightening to America as if the skeletal witnesses in anthropology departments and national museums had suddenly risen from their numbered boxes and begun to testify. The mythology of a nation built on discovery, democracy, and manifest destiny begins to fall apart, and the old foundation, bereft of bones, cannot hold it up. Miranda tells us in this quote, in her work, that Indigenous women's erotics are not only antithetical to the existence of settler nations whose existence is predicated in large measure on colonial violence against women and Two-Spirit people, among others, but that her expression of the erotic is also at odds with science as a technology of that colonial power, and the ways that it makes, the way that it works to make sense of indigeneity. Miranda here is, of course, working in relation to Audre Lorde's uses of the erotic, where Lorde writes, quote, "It feels right to me," acknowledges the strength of the erotic into a true knowledge. For what that means is the first and most powerful guiding light towards any understanding, unquote. Reading Miranda and Lorde together, "It feels right to me," helps reveal settler scientific taxonomies for what they are, the unreflexive logics upholding colonial violence. Importantly, none of this engagement with science is either neutral or distant. Miranda describes a foundation that her erotic power works to erode, unsettling all that which sits atop. Next slide, please. My engagement with Indigenous STS draws its strength and most long-standing inspiration from the work of Kim Tallbear, including her approaches to Indigenous feminist inquiry and its applications to genome science. In her 2014 article, Standing with and Speaking as Faith, Dr. Tallbear speaks to the reversal, or to her reversal, of the ethnographic gaze onto genome scientists, writing, quote, "In studying scientists, however, I found it discomfort. I could not shake that feminist ethical imperative to study a community in whose projects I could be invested." She goes on to say, quote, "Indigenous feminist objectivity, that is inquiring not at a distance, but based on the lives and knowledge priorities of subjects, helps open up one's mind to working in non-standard ways," unquote. This insight to draw near and to make intimate our relations with genome science, I find to be a core aspect of Indigenous STS approach. And much of what you hear today I owe to Kim and to others working relationally on the science problem. Next slide, please. My engagement with Indigenous STS is also lived relationally with my dear friend and co-thinker Jessica Kulopenick, whose writing for me has given additional substance or light upon Indigenous STS as an approach, although I don't think she would use those words. Her insights will, I believe, be profoundly impactful for all of us who do and aspire to do this work well. In her article, Muscaswin, Indigenous Science, Technology, and Society, Dr. Kolopenik builds upon Dr. Tallbear's and others' work. She writes that Indigenous STS reorders the racializing, gendered, gendering epistemologies that loom across time spaces of coloniality and that would continue to maintain colonial sovereignties and dispossession through reiterations of indigeneity. This recognizes the role of science as a technology that helped to produce and maintain colonial power and indigenous dispossession. And her work identifies at least two and more aspects of Indigenous STS approach, that two of which I want to highlight here. First is that as a form of science studies, we're concerned with how scientific knowledge gets produced, by whom, and for what. With the knowledge that non-Indigenous peoples have historically claimed exclusive rights to legitimate knowledge about nature, and the conviction that science produced by, for, and with Indigenous peoples is not just science as usual. The second is that Indigenous STS also entails going beyond just describing the machinations of how science gets made and its implications for Indigenous peoples. Indigenous STS also entails reordering, disrupting, and unsettling scientific knowledge production. It entails not just mapping what the lab does, but taking it on as a site in need of critical transformation in order to restore life and expand the sovereignties of Indigenous peoples. My goal in engaging this form of STS is therefore not to critique nor to save science, and I never much cared for holy work anyway. The fantasy is for a bent or a better or kinked science that is brought into more relational forms with Indigenous peoples and that can no longer be wholly distinguishable as a separate thing. As Max Liboiron has noted, to bend the arrow of science and send it careening in some other direction. Right, it's not this fantasy of what science will be, or it's not this specific future of what science will become, but rather to bend it and send it in some other direction. So I say to scientists, get bent. But again, bringing in Lord, here recognizing the power of the erotic within our lives can give us energy to pursue genuine change within our world, rather than merely settling for a shift of characters in the same weary drama. The goal here is to change the who and the what of science. Next slide, please. Thank you. With another close co-thinker, Samantha Archer, we've written, theorized, and operationalized queer science in our article Bisexual Science. So I'm going to draw here not only from Indigenous science studies, but also position myself as a scholar who's engaged in queer approach to inquiry as well. Here, I'm briefly going to describe what we've done, but we work from the longstanding feminist and queer insight that the binarization of knowledge is ultimately dependent on other binaries that's built up from sex and gender binaries, and therefore has divided the way that we make knowledge and given rise to all of the disciplinary divides that now characterize the Western academy. So I'm pulling together here both approaches from Indigenous STS, but also queer STS in our moves to, I wouldn't say to disrupt disciplinary divides, but rather to decry or deny that these divides are useful in the work that we're going to do. Next slide, please. So at the confluence of feminist, queer, and Indigenous STS, our goal has been to work relationally to do what I think cannot be done alone. While our standpoints, training, and embodiments are many, what I think what we have in the crosshairs of an Indigenous and a queer STS approach are our shared problems such as colonial masculinity, heterosexist objectivity, and others. We therefore have a shared stake in unsettling these problems for a world in which we can live. Next slide, please. In the last part of this talk, I want to point to one example of the power of an Indigenous STS approach on the workings of genome science, the ways we bring these theories of power to the bench to change the way that science is functioning. As I mentioned before, science and colonialism are co-constituted. We've had multiple examples of this throughout the panel, so I won't go into that in any more detail. But in the case of genome science, Kim Tallbear has noted that science and colonialism are co-constituted within the context of the Genome Lab, and that genome science has acted to disaggregate Indigenous peoples as peoples and reaggregate them under settler scientific concepts of race. This disaggregation and reaggregation within the Genome Lab leads to problems including, as we know, the proliferation of pretendians using genetic ancestry to claim Indigenous belonging, in ways that represent moves against Indigenous sovereignty, continued moves against Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination and dispossession. Even using genomic ties with Indigenous peoples, these technologies that are supposedly providing these ties, to enable settler pursuits of land and hunting rights, among other things. This is, of course, a large problem that has many lines of critique, building on Dr. Tallbear's and others' work, Native American DNA. My question in engaging in this molecularization of Indigenous or indigeneity is, what are the conditions of possibility in the lab that have made these molecular claims to indigeneity possible in the first place? So knowing that these critiques have identified this as a key source of the Genome Lab as a technology of settler claims to indigeneity, what are the conditions of possibility in the lab that made these claims possible in the first place? So I want to give an example that comes from both a lab ethnography, but also a new genome analysis that tries to bring multiple approaches together to address this problem. And to do this, I turned to frozen biobanks as archives of the Genome Lab. Specifically, I began working with a blood collection formerly housed at the University of California, Davis. This collection was originally assembled in the 1990s for research into ancient population histories and health. It was collected from a variety of research participants through the Indian Health Services System in the US. Next slide, please. Now, in thinking about cryopreserved blood collections, Joanna Radin and Emma Kowal's formulation of cryopolitics tells us that frozen biobanks are one important entry point for questioning the workings of technoscientific power. For it's not only blood, but also the history of genome research and its relations with Indigenous peoples that are locked within the freezer. Radin and Kowal describe the act of freezing as one that is simultaneously creative and destructive, where the social and technological architectures of cryopreservation maintain the conditions necessary for certain possibilities, but foreclose others. And the relative weight of these creative and destructive capacities is shaped by time, place, power, and scientists' own situated capacities for making knowledge. In studying this particular biobank at the University of California, Davis, my initial interaction with it was to literally lift the lid on this and wait until the fog, the mist of this cryopreserved blood collection dissipated, and to begin looking at the tubes that were held within as an archive of scientific practice. And what I found was that on the tubes, they were often marked with measures of blood quantum, which is a crude purity rubric that was imposed upon Indigenous peoples, and of course now has become one way in which tribal citizenship, at least within the US, is defined. Each of these tubes contain labels denoting blood quantum. And in engaging with these tubes, what we found is if we lifted ones that were quote unquote pure natives, these tubes were empty. And if we pulled out tubes that had some fraction of a blood quantum that was regarded as something other than pure, that these tubes had not been worked with at all, that they were still full of the original biospecimen that was collected from Indigenous peoples. So what's happened here is that originally these samples were collected from anyone with an Indigenous, anyone who was a tribal member in the US. But there have been subsequent actions to filter and renegotiate who counts as Indigenous between the syringe and the laboratory bench, with scientists selectively putting on layers of what counts as truly Indigenous from their own frame that have then become molecularized in what we know about the genetic landscape of the Americas. So attending to the processes through which Indigenous blood collections have been assembled and reconfigured, and the choices through which some blood samples are exhausted while others remain, is to chart how scientists have molecularized certain ideas about indigeneity and how they have come to matter in genomics, while others have not. and to encounter these critical sites of divergence between scientific and Indigenous modes of knowing and belonging. So an Indigenous STS approach, of course, is not only to understand how this process is working, it's very clear to see as we're engaging with this cryopreserved blood collection, how scientists have gone about making these decisions and how that's come to matter. But I want to do something for Indigenous STS. I want to go beyond just tracing how scientists have molecularized indigeneity and ask, what if we started from a different place with the conviction that Indigenous peoples are who they say they are, and without these laboratory imposed definitions of who counts as Indigenous that are aligned to biological notions of race? How might bringing a different theory of power and a different Indigenous STS approach into the lab alter what comes to matter in genome science? Next slide, please. So we began looking at the amount, so what we did was we turned to this and said, what would happen if we reanalyzed the consented samples here, adding back in all of those who'd been excluded by these crude purity metrics that scientists had previously imposed? And how would that show us both how the genetic diversity of the continent has been understood, but what has been left out, and how that might matter in upholding this structure of settler claims to indigeneity via genetic ancestry testing? Excuse me. So we began by looking at, what we did was group individuals based on the consent. We grouped individuals by region and not by tribal affiliation. And what we did was begin by looking at the amount of genetic diversity that was present in each of those previously studied collections, right? So the ones that they had, this is including data that was not left out, not leaving out individuals who were supposedly mixed race or having a fraction of blood quantum. And we looked at what genetic diversity had been accounted for in the past using this purity rubric that had been imposed on sample selection. And then what we did was apply the same techniques that have been used in the past to all of these samples that have been left out in the past, and look at how metrics of genetic diversity change. So what you're seeing here is two figures. It's a bar plot, one on the left, one on the right, looking at different metrics of maternal genetic diversity, a small portion of the genome that we look at to calculate, or that we can look at to calculate genetic diversity. And genetic diversity is just talking about the variety of different the composition, the variety and the composition of DNA present in any population. And what we've done is calculate for each of the regions, Southeast, Northern Plains, West, and Pacific Northwest, the amount of genetic diversity from a measure of 0, meaning everyone's the same, to 1, everyone's different genetically, in each of those regions. We then added in all these samples that had been previously excluded from the standpoint of, we are going to trust that Indigenous people's own self-definitions are what is going to count as what the genetic diversity that's present in the continent. And can you click, Marisa? And again. And what we found when we worked from definitions of Indigenous sovereignty is that it changes, it alters sometimes quite dramatically the knowledge that we can make about the genetic diversities of the Americas. We find that systematically the amount of genetic diversity has been underestimated. And this really matters, especially because there's been so much health research done around in health, and precision medicine is a huge motivator for in additional research, genetic research in Indigenous communities. But what we found is that genetic diversity has been systematically underestimated, meaning that we have a really not full understanding of the genetic diversity, and that really impacts our ability to understand the links between genetic diversity and health outcomes. That's a whole other talk. I'll leave it at that. We also found that there was a whole bunch of genetic diversity that is inherited from ancestors who were originally non-Indigenous that is introduced into these communities, that they are not genetically coherent groups. And I can't show this slide today for time, but I want to talk through it a little bit. That Indigenous peoples and tribal groups and even regional groups are not genetically coherent or bounded biological groups. Now, this is obvious because Indigenous peoples have already told us this, but what this finding does is to unravel or unsettle the ways in which genome science has said what counts as Indigenous is a bounded category, and helps to unsettle the ways that this work is used to make claims to Indigenous belonging. Because if Indigenous peoples are in fact not coherent genetic groups, then how does one make genetic claims to them? And the next slide. We also wanted to show, if we lay out these this genetic diversity onto space, if we actually visualize spatially how this genetic diversity plays out on the continental scale, what we find is the amount of DNA that has been introduced originally by a non-Indigenous ancestor, but now, of course, in Indigenous communities, is decreasing from east to west, mirroring westward expansion of the settler-colonial state. This history has been almost completely erased in most of genome research up until about the last 5 years or so. The vast majority of research has been of continental origins, the peopling of the continents, and that type of thing. And because of these decisions around purity, not only does it have consequences for molecularizing the category of indigeneity, it also has a consequence of what histories become visible in genome research, where the histories of settler colonial expansion are erased from that data. So this enables us to tell another story, one in which Indigenous peoples survive to the present. Oh, goodness, lost my notes there. It shows the endurance of Indigenous peoples as peoples in spite of that history, as groups that are not genetically constituted. So there's a lot more I could say about this work, but for time, I want to pass it on to Nicole Charles, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Rick, and to all my panelists, and again to Marissa for that opening. My name is Nicole Charles. I'm an assistant professor of Women and Gender Studies at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and I'm speaking to you today from Takaranto, which is a place of long-standing Indigenous relations and has long been the home of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples and part of the original homelands of the Wendat peoples. I'm grateful to live and work here amid so much vibrant Indigenous, Black, and Afro-diasporic, feminist, queer, STS critique. I appear on your screen as a Black woman with shoulder-length curly Black hair. I'm wearing a long-sleeve Black shirt and sitting in a white room with a brown chair behind me, and there's a large plant on either side of the chair. Next slide, please. Rocks hold memory. Land holds memory. Water always remembers. The relational story I want to tell today begins in Barbados, affectionately called the Rock or D-Rock by some locals, a limestone island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and the easternmost Caribbean country, stretching 34 kilometers in length, and according to locals, it's just a smile wide. Barbados holds the infamous position as the world's first Black slave society in the 17th to 19th centuries. And over the past 6 years, I've been thinking and writing about some of this land's, this rocks, and its people's residues as they manifest themselves through the rubric of suspicion. I first came to appreciate suspicion when the term was used by an Afro-Barbadian nurse at a Barbadian public clinic who I was interviewing about Barbadian parents' hesitancy to the then newly introduced HPV vaccine. Slide, please. This nurse, like many of the Afro-Barbadian parents with whom I later interacted, used the adjective suspicious to describe their patients' feelings toward the vaccine, how it came to be introduced to the public, fellow citizens, and Barbadian culture more generally. I became intrigued by this idea of suspicion, its relationship to the term hesitancy, and how Barbadians were invoking it to characterize their attachments and relations to the HPV vaccine. Like refusal, a concept and practice that has been theorized extensively by many of my brilliant Black and Indigenous STS colleagues, including Kim Tolbear, Eve Tuck, Ruha Benjamin, and others, suspicion is generative, both constitutive of and co-constituted by Afro-Barbadians' everyday histories, political realities, and researches ethnographic encounters and experiences in Barbados. And yet suspicion is not an active form of refusal. Next slide, please. Instead, following my interlocutors, I've come to appreciate suspicion as an embodied affective relation, one that circulates within the various socioeconomic, political, cultural, and historical formulations that contextualize the HPV vaccine, growing assemblages of multinational pharmaceutical networks and the post-colonial Barbadian state, and longer transnational histories of slavery, capitalist extraction, and public health. In conversation with a body of transnational feminist scholarship that is attuned to the afterlives of slavery, I consider what it means to understand suspicion toward this vaccine as theory and praxis both, as generative and fraught, sticky and contagious because it is palimpsestic, living and lasting in and between bodies, in embodied memories and histories of Afro-Barbadians in ways that are difficult, if not impossible, to let go of. With an invitation to consider good relations, I'm also intrigued about what it means to explore the bad or fraught relations that too emerge as a result of the capitalist, imperialist, military, industrial modes of research and development through which technologies are often created. I'm particularly interested in what it means to develop a conceptual frame from which to understand suspicious engagements or suspicion toward these technoscientific advances, to trace a genealogy of that which is often referred to as unthinkable, unintelligible, unsettling. So why study suspicion? How do we study suspicion? Next slide, please. In conversation with critical technoscience scholars who have spoken against both the Eurocentrism and US centrism of technoscience, and taking inspiration from the multiple ways that Black cultural production can, as Catherine McKittrick argues, quote, write scientific knowledge anew, I understand suspicion as a mode of Black technoscience, where science and the systems that uphold it, so anti-Blackness, patriarchy, white supremacy, collide. Taking seriously McKittrick's call to breach the recursive field of feminist science and technology studies and processes of scientific knowledge production that perpetuate anti-Blackness, I ask what suspicion can teach us about technoscience and biomedicine's fictive perimeters while holding space for its fallibility and opening to its generativity. Next slide, please. When we understand suspicion as affective rather than an intentional form of resistance, it necessarily complicates narratives around suspicion as mere irrational refusals of biomedical protection or caring work, and/or refusals that are based in public misunderstandings of science. In post-colonial Barbados, as Afro-Barbadian, suspicion attaches to the capitalist interest behind the pharmaceutical promotion of the HPV vaccine to young Black girls in particular, and to historical tropes of hypersexuality. The term hesitancy's historical tropes are revealed, exposing the persistence of histories of racialized science in the 21st century and Afro-Barbadians' warranted concerns of the same. As Afro-Barbadian parents repeatedly expressed to me, suspicion is prudent and believed to be protective from these and other injurious realities or potentials. Even as popular media has to some extent begun to steer the conversation away from ignorance and misunderstandings of science towards such discussions of an erosion of racialized people's trust in scientific practice, medicine and technoscience continue to engage in what Ruha Benjamin terms analytic somersaults in order to frame affects like suspicion and medical distrust both as inexplicable because, well, they are rooted in events of the past. As late Haitian anthropologist Michelle Rolfe-Trouillot reminds us, the past, or more accurately, pastness, is a position. In no way can we identify the past as past. As long as Black people's lives remain devalued and imperiled socially and politically, such that this devaluation is entrenched into the now, there is no benefit in believing the fiction of the past, or that Black folks are merely obsessed with or burdened by the past, to speak alongside Saidiya Hartman. Rather than reckoning with this history, It is suspicion that is overwhelmingly viewed as something to be overcome in favor of biomedical certainty. Next slide, please. The antonym of hesitation, certainty, refers to truth, fact, assuredness, and absence of doubt. Positioning themselves as the vanguards of biomedical truth, the doctors and nurses I interviewed stressed to me the importance of projecting a sense of certainty about the dangers of HPV, the scientific efficacy of the HPV vaccine, and the ills of the internet in order to mitigate and override parents' suspicion. When I first began writing about suspicion in the wake of the 2016 US presidential race, concerns were just beginning to swarm the North American media around the influence of fake news on the American election and its increasing capacity to distort a series of social and political incidents globally. More worrisome than rumor or incorrect, potentially accidental sources of misinformation, fake news was becoming distinguishable for its intentionally and verifiably false disinformation, which often follows the conventions of reputable journalism to create the impression of validity. Amid the then widespread international public hysteria around online fake news articles, cautioning parents against turning to social media and the internet for verifiable information about the HPV vaccine became central to the Barbadian Ministry of Health's messaging around the HPV vaccine. Within our interviews, Barbadian doctors and nurses reiterated this concern around the growing popularity of social media as a source of medical disinformation. Alongside international public health efforts to mitigate the influence of growing anti-vaccination forums online, Barbadian health professionals decried these groups and the internet, believing them to be directly associated with fake news and parents' suspicion toward the HPV vaccine. Through this seemingly benign discursive process of linking suspicion with anti-vaccination rhetoric and fake news, several entwined material and ideological moves are accomplished. First, this move elides the voices of the Afro-Barbadians for whom suspicion attaches to the HPV vaccine, its pharmaceutical manufacturers and state administrators, the uncharacteristic way in which it was introduced in Barbados, colonial tropes of Black female hypersexuality, and longer related histories of biomedical injustice and experimentation on Black women from the period of slavery. By overlooking these complex politics, affects, and histories, suspicion becomes effectively and dangerously conflated with anti-vaccine sentiment, come disinformation, and fake news. And second, through this process, both vaccination and its benefits are heralded as authoritative modes of absolute truth and certainty, the antithesis of suspicion, which ought to be eliminated. While suspicion and certainly vaccine hesitancy might exist alongside anti-vaccination sentiment for some people, the two ought not be conflated. Though for many of the Afro-Barbadian parents with whom I spoke, suspicion did engender refusal of the HPV vaccine, it simultaneously asked questions of and fostered its own understandings of care and protection, and the Barbadian state's accountability to its citizens amid its enmeshment in global state industry assemblages. By subsuming parents' suspicion within the rubric of fake news, medical professionals effectively obscure these realities and possibilities, overlooking suspicion's capacity to work to unsettle science in favor and in service of better relations. Accompanying many professionals' valid concerns about fake news and their frequent conflation of anti-vaccination propaganda and suspicion is a belief in the certainty of biomedical knowledge and of biotechnologies like the HPV vaccine as uncontestable forms of protection. Still, though, many of the nurses I interviewed offered insight into the multiple suspicions that simultaneously exist within the medical profession. While Barbadian nurses and doctors were generally unified in critiquing Afro-Barbadian parents' misinformed beliefs and online activities as the main drivers behind suspicion, they also inadvertently revealed that the binary they so often projected between suspicion and certainty is in reality more tenuous than they would like it to be. Indeed, alongside their espoused certainty about parents' lack of internet literacy, the efficacy of the HPV vaccine, and the harms of suspicion, were deep-seated suspicions about each other and the degree of certainty and strength in public outreach that each group, so doctors and nurses, was presumed to have in convincing the Barbadian public of the safety, efficacy, and necessity of the then newly introduced HPV vaccine. So the context here is that it is typically public health nurses who have historically introduced vaccines to the Barbadian public through polyclinics or public clinics. Though the introduction of the HPV vaccine was quite different, there was a lot of media attention, foreign public actors, high-profile doctors from the Pan American Health Organization, and this led to a lot of dismay among nurses and doctors. Doctors painted nurses as ill-equipped to do this particular job, ironically, because of their own perceived ambivalence. Nurses painting doctors as ill-equipped to do this job because it wasn't typically their job. Positioning suspicion as oppositional and at best inversely related to certainty overlooks the possible simultaneity, fallibility, and generativity of suspicion and certainty, and further perpetuates an untenable binary between the two. Despite fixating on the role their colleagues' certainty or lack thereof had in influencing parent suspicion, doctors and nurses often defeatedly revealed their own ambivalence towards the vaccine. Temporarily removing their medical hats, doctors and nurses often surprised me by casually sharing their suspicions about the vaccine as racialized Barbadian parents and citizens themselves. When I asked one doctor if they could at all empathize with parents' sense of suspicion, despite the seriousness and severity of cervical cancer in Barbados, they responded, "Well, of course. I don't know many people who aren't ambivalent. I'm even a little ambivalent," and quickly changed the topic to share how they attempt to convince parents to accept the vaccine anyway. Such brief confessionary narratives from Barbadian doctors and nurses illustrate the fallibility of certainty, its inevitable liability to doubt, tentativeness, and unreliability, especially as it relates to the apparatus of technoscience. Next slide, please. Overdrawing the opposition between suspicion and certainty in an attempt to overcome the former threatens to limit our attention to what these rubrics collectively offer scholars of healthcare and practitioners who are invested in care and caring relations. And yet, as an affect mobilized toward protection, suspicion is simultaneously fallible and fraught. Like the precarious and unstable discourses of biomedical certainty, suspicion holds inescapable shortcomings amid high rates of cervical cancer in the Caribbean. Should suspicion lead only to continued refusal rather than an acceptance of its necessary unsettling of science, and therefore low HPV vaccine uptake rates within Barbados, we must also question the fate of the very Afro-Barbadian teenagers whose parents are seeking protection via suspicion and at times via vaccine refusal. To label suspicion as fraught is to recognize this and its capacity for unsettling science. It's to call into question our quest for ways of knowing, recognizing, fixing, and preventing that reinscribe or replicate colonial modes of knowledge, and to open to different forms of care and relationality that suspicion asks of. Suspicion invites presence, thinking together, it invites accountability for the too long unfettered and unaccountable racialized violence and non-innocent histories of technoscience, medicine, and at times public health. Suspicion asks us to turn toward our entanglements in violent relations of technoscience and biomedical injustice, and invites us to imagine a more complicated, denaturalized story about how we have come to the curative logics of care we are immersed within, toward a what can be known, as Lisa Lowe so beautifully says. When asked to suggest an image for my forthcoming book, Suspicion, and to describe the tone I'd like it to convey, I was drawn to Barbadian artist Simone Asia's work. Next slide, please. In Waterlogged, illustrated by hand using pen, colored pencils, ink, collage, and glitter, Asia develops this character using space, line, and intricate detail. I'm drawn first to their dark, deep eyes and their lips, dripping, crying, bleeding emotion. ambivalence, worry, perhaps sadness. But zoom out and up, and there are layers, quite literally collaged here, of beauty, land, flowers, and growth. Like suspicion, this image is pensive, the use of details and repetition reflective of suspicion's palimpsestic and spatiotemporal nature. Imperfectly erased, yet still visible, still tangible, residual. Drawing your gaze down the image to the person's neck to what looks like roots, ropes, chains, and below that to the deep indigo blues reminiscent of water and its secrets that insist on the enduring of coloniality. This water unsettles, and as Alexander reminds us, always remembers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to stop the screen share at this point, and I'm going to go ahead and let's see, choose the option where we can appear on screen. So hopefully our panelists are, if not prepared, to share their background. At least you can stop your video, if you're not comfortable. So thank you so much. I hope the audience will thank me in joining our speakers today. We only have about 4 minutes left. And the first thing I wanted to do was open the floor to our panelists to offer commentary to each other, to share insights, or if there's any questions. I know that after speaking, sometimes there's a moment of you just need to stop and take a breath, and maybe you're not there yet. But I wanted to offer our panelists the first opportunity for commentary in our last few minutes.
Say one thing, Jessica, when you spoke about doing things in a bad way, how powerful that was to think about the necessity of that for good relations. Just a comment.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Also, I'm just still processing your talk. I was messaging Rick while you were talking and just saying, "This is such a smart talk. Oh my God!" Just, taking so much from it, and so also it was making me think about. So a few months back, myself and Rick and Dr. Tallbear and another one of our colleagues, we were talking about Indigenous peoples and pandemics, and we were talking about the difference between vaccine hesitancy, or what now I have the language to say is suspicion by Indigenous peoples around the COVID-19 vaccines, and how that is quite distinct from what we're seeing in terms of like the anti-vaxxers and the ways in which that's connected to also cultures of white nationalism and what have you. So thank you for this language, and I'm incredibly excited for your book to come out.
Thank you so much.
I wanted to thank Kelly for your children's book. I mean, for your work entirely, but the children's book is something that is just, I used to be a children's librarian before I went into information science. And for those who are not familiar with the practice, children's librarian is a very political space, because that's when you're introducing children to their first reading materials, when they're 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, they're starting to develop ontologies for the world of knowing. And it's extremely difficult to find books that are written for young people who come from a number of life experiences, backgrounds, language groups. And yeah, I just wish it had been around when I had been in charge of ordering books. That was like 15, 20 years ago. It was a long time ago. So thank you for that. And also thank you for sharing it during a plenary session. Sometimes I think the weakness of scientists is that we go straight for the abstract, conceptual, most challenging technical verbiage that we can when we just need to stop and allow the words, to fill us, and in a way that gosh, I don't know. I'm struggling with the words, but maybe I'll borrow a word from Nicole, from your work, that's affective. So thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much. That's very kind. Yeah, one of the things I was thinking about is what does it mean to present on the end of a conference on a Saturday in the middle of a semester during a pandemic. And so that's where I thought it might be a good thing to share. Thank you.
We only have 30 seconds left, and I hear they're going to cut it off immediately. So I think that I will just use this last few seconds to once again say thank you. And I'm so excited to our panelists, to be in company with our panelists. And like everybody, I was just taking these notes and just feel very inspired and motivated to continue the work that I'm doing. I hope that all who are attending today took good notes as well. All the references are excellent, the slides and the fine words, wonderful. And thank you, everyone.